In addition to new ship designs, we see another few things taking place in technology. One is going to be the compass. This is going to really change the way people are able to navigate on the ocean. It's going to be improved over time, and it would eventually spread to Southeast Asia and the Middle East and then to Europe, where in the transmission of things it was actually improved. Another navigational device is going to be the astrolabe. It was very, very important because sailors could now know where they were sailing at night because you lined up the astrolabe with the North Star. This made shipping a lot safer because before this, the only way you could sail was during the daytime, and usually you did not want to get past that point where you couldn't see land. And of course, being close to land had its own dangers with pirates and people who were constantly attacking the ships to get their loads off of them. So the astrolabe is going to be very helpful there. Then we're going to see another level of transmission, and that's going to be the process of paper. Paper had been a Chinese invention. It was invented in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then a number of Chinese are going to be captured in the Middle East. And when they were captured, they discovered how to make paper, and they put these people to work. And the first paper manufacturing operation in the Middle East proper was in the 8th and 9th centuries. Western Europeans would learn about paper from their contact with the Arabs, and the first European paper factory was established in Sicily, reasonably close to the Middle East, in the early 1200s. Now again, this is not a really fast transmission of stuff. It took a couple of centuries, but in measuring the way we've looked at things such as agriculture being transmitted from one place to the others, this was really fast. Agriculture took thousands of years to reach one place from another. So economic impact, consumer taste, cultural exchanges, technological diffusion, all of these added up to a significant level of consequences of environmental factors surrounding a new level of interregional contacts. Now, the final point I want to make here is talking about consequences with the societies in Asia, Africa, and Europe in maintaining or increasing their commitment to these international activities. The fact was that the utility of international activities or interregional connections was so obvious at this point that some kind of interregional system would survive any disruptions that took place in the original systems themselves. Most obviously, we have noted changes such as the Arab capacity to sustain major initiatives in the interregional arena even after it declined. We're going to see that the trade routes are going to be more important than things such as religion. The trade routes will win out in the long run. But the system was simply, again, too precious to abandon. As the Arabs sustaining their system yielded to other entrants, the clear result was continued commitment and continued capacity to sustain interregional contacts, either along the established trade routes or on the alternative routes that would develop precisely because of this new level of commitment, this new understanding of resulting benefits. So what was the result of all these activities? Why are we making such a big fuss about this? A number of results developed from these trading patterns that were important at the time and also set precedents for later activity. I mentioned already the extent to which this level of interregional trade could have had a major impact on internal economies, particularly the economy of China, was already an effect of no small magnitude. Some areas of the world, again, particularly in China, began to orient a good bit of their economic activity toward production for what we call today world markets. New kinds of consumer dependence developed as well. We don't usually think of post-classical societies as consumer societies of people going and buying things that they want and need, but in a modern sense they really weren't. But really, this clearly was a period that hints that there is something big coming in the future as far as trade and consumerism goes. Certain elements of the upper classes in a number of societies developed taste for goods that could only be supplied from distant regions. We'll mention several of them here. A clear example occurred in Western Europe during and after the Crusades. The Crusades began in the later 11th century as West Europeans, particularly noblemen, participated in the Crusades. As they did this, they learned of higher living standards that were common in Middle Eastern cities, and they developed a taste for some of the products that they had. A particularly interesting example that would motivate a tremendous amount of European activity from this point onward into the 19th century is sugar. Post-classical Europeans traditionally had sweetened their products with honey, which actually probably was quite sensible and probably quite pleasant. But for whatever reasons, and we don't pretend to know why, they liked sugar better. They couldn't make it at home. They couldn't grow sugar cane, and they had no way of really knowing how to make sugar. So they began an obvious and consistent effort to acquire access to more regular supplies of sugar. Initially, still for the upper classes, this was not yet a mass taste that everyone had, but still the upper classes began to have an attachment to sugar that helped feed the activities of many merchants, both European and Asian. It helped spur new kinds of shipping activities in the Mediterranean that would link Europe to Middle Eastern ports where products could be transshipped from other parts of Asia. This kind of consumer attachment was itself a major variable in world history from this point onward. Not all societies developed equal levels of susceptibility to consumer needs. China, for example, had an elaborate urban consumer culture in the post-classical period, but they needed far fewer products from the outside world than Western Europe did. China did need to trade with Southeast Asia, mainly because they were looking for certain kinds of tea, but their needs otherwise were pretty limited. China would see much greater effort to seek from world trade other kinds of products that personal consumer items were kind of like exotic animals for zoos, handfuls, not masses, but handfuls of slaves, and particularly precious metals. As these goods moved along the new trade routes in response to the supply of Chinese manufacturing products, there were new kinds of economic impact, consumer attachments, and even dependence on international trade. A third item, obviously, was a new level of cultural contact. Some of this involved simply a matter of word exchanged from one language to the next. A large number of words began to pass into the European languages from Arabic, denoting the kinds of products that were now being transshipped from other parts of the world to Europe. Terms such as orange, for example, or sugar, are Arabic words translated into the major European languages because these were the words that described initially what the products themselves were. But other kinds of cultural exchange were obviously even more important. Particularly noteworthy was the extent to which what Europeans called the Arabic numbering system, or Arabic numerals, became into wide use during this period. This system had been developed in classical India. It was not Arabic, but the Arabs had taken it over from the Indians. Europeans and others in this period would take it over from the Arabs, providing what is still the most efficient numbering system ever developed in the world, a numbering system that now began to gain what we would call today real international currency. Mathematical systems spread widely as well. Algebra is another Arabic word, and Arabic mathematical innovation as well, and it began to spread from the Arab world to other societies, including Europe. Not surprisingly then, new levels of commercial contacts spurred other kinds of cultural interaction, even across the otherwise what seemed major religious barriers. For example, the barrier between Islam and Christianity. Even though that barrier was there, trade often went on between Arabs and Europeans. A classic example would be the development of the taste for coffee in Europe, which was actually adopted from the Arab use of coffee. Technologies were impacted by new levels of world trade in two ways. First, a number of new technologies were introduced during the post-classical period deliberately to facilitate new kinds of trading activities, particularly new kinds of seagoing commercial activities. Ship design improved. The Arabs introduced significant developments in sailing ships, particularly making them more appropriate for use on the Indian Ocean. Toward the end of the post-classical period, the Chinese introduced gigantic ocean-going vessels, the Chinese junks. That was the name for them. No, we think of junk today as being trash, but originally started with the name for a Chinese ship, which was huge and gangly looking, but actually very efficient on the ocean. They had large hulls and large carrying capacity, and they began to use this from the Song dynasty onward to link eastern China and the Indian Ocean trade routes. Okay, well, let's wrap this up. Real quickly reviewing what we went over, we talked about a new range and intensity of contacts that spread throughout the world, along with religions, ideas, cultural development that occurred. And we looked at Ibn Battuta, first of all, in the 14th century, who was one of the greatest world travelers. We talked about his role in traveling the world and telling about his travels. We talked about his role as far as being influenced by Islam. And we talked about the fact that he went to China and that he experienced a culture there that was very different to his and that he sometimes didn't like it. We talked about Marco Polo, who may or may not have participated in all his travels, but we do know that he is important because of some of his writings that motivated others like Christopher Columbus to go on their adventures in the future. And then we looked at patterns of contacts. We looked at the different routes that were formed. We talked about the Indian Ocean trade, Muslims being involved in a lot of this trade from India, Southeast Asia, and other places. We also talked about the Persians' involvements. We talked about some of the goods that were taken along the way: silk, porcelain, spices, other things. And then we talked about the Asian trade pattern that resulted in manufacturing expansions. China developed a lot of industries during the Song dynasty. Then we talked about how these trade routes fed into the east-west contact, which is going to be critically important because the contact with Europe and how Europe ends up taking a lot of ideas and actually pretty much conquering the world with borrowed ideas. We talked about a north-south route that was from Scandinavia through Russia and the Ukraine, passed through Kiev. We talked about some of the consequences of the trading patterns. The economies changed. China became a very powerful world power, and they have come back strong today. We talked about Western Europeans, particularly noblemen, who learned to have a taste for products that came from the East and from Asia. We talked about sugar in particular. We also talked about an attachment that Europeans got to the products that came from these other places. We talked about cultural contact. Very important here, the idea that when cultures come together, you have cultural diffusion, or you have the sharing of ideas. We talked about paper. We talked about the Arabic number system, some of the words from